Hello and welcome to the Overland Journal podcast. I'm your host, Scott Brady, and I am here with my co-host, Matt Scott.
Yeah, that's me. I'm here.
And we have a special guest today.
Very special.
Very special.
Yeah, we have Jim West with us today, and Jim is a notable character in our community, and he's also a very experienced overlander and traveler himself, and he has participated in the Camel Trophy, and he also currently does a lot of instruction with 7P International. So we're going to talk today about the principles of overlanding, and we're going to talk specifically about recovery. So thanks for being with us today,
Absolutely,
Jim.
my pleasure. My pleasure.
And a special thanks to Danner Boots, who is supporting this episode today. Danner's new Logger 917 was inspired by the classic pattern and lines of Danner's original caulked logging boots made in the Pacific Northwest. They're built with Danner's trusted quality and durability. The Logger 917 is designed to ensure you're comfortable and dry wherever your adventure takes you, even if it includes a little bit of recovery along the way. With a Gore-Tex waterproof liner and a Vibram SPE rubberized EVA midsole, the Logger 917 offers performance, waterproofing, and lightweight comfort, all in a rugged yet refined style. Thanks, Danner. So when we talk about the principles of overlanding, one of the things that we want to focus on is getting as close as we can to those first principles, which is what we're going to discuss today. And we're also going to introduce a little bit of a new concept, which is we're going to try to introduce the counterpoint to all of these things that are more traditionally discussed.
Yeah.
So it's this idea of falsifiability, because we're not talking about math and we're not talking about physics. So when you're talking about opinion, we recognize that there are always other ways of doing it. So we want the listener and the viewer, in the case if you're watching us on YouTube, to know that there is not always one way to do this, that there's other ways to do it. You have to be really careful when people use words like always or never. In my experience, that just usually means that they have very little experience. So we're going to really be careful about the always and nevers, but we are going to talk about things like the terms used around recovery. We're going to talk about not getting stuck in the first place. We're going to talk about the right equipment, and we're going to go into some other points of conversation around all of that, including vehicle-mounted winches. So let's start off with some of the disclosures that we need to go through today. So go for it.
There are some. Yeah, I'm the U.S. importer for MaxTrax. We're talking about recovery equipment. We're going to talk about recovery boards. I think that's an important thing for the reader, the listener to know. I'm going to have an inherent bias on that stuff. And I guess, Jim, with 7P, you guys are also manufacturing recovery equipment.
Yes.
You're also a service provider of four-wheel drive training. So we always like to just be, very upfront, out in the clear about any kind of biases that we have, so we don't have to then dwell on them later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and what that means is, as a listener, you can just choose to ignore anything that we talk about around MaxTrax or about 7P. But we are going to include it because these are things that we've used and we have some experience around that you may form your own opinion about. And there are, of course, alternatives to these things as well that we can include in the show notes. But let's start with these critical terms. So one of the first things we need to determine when we're doing a recovery is it a dynamic recovery or is it a static recovery? Now, that is a term that I like to get into the mindset of, am I moving a tree off of the trail, or am I in a very slow speed, very precise recovery maneuver, particularly in rocks? If you think about expensive sheet metal, you normally don't want to build in a whole bunch of energy into the system when you're trying to be very precise around a winching operation. So we call those static recoveries. When they're dynamic, that can be vehicle to vehicle, which means we're using a kinetic energy recovery rope. Or if we're doing winching and driving, oftentimes we will introduce components into the rigging that allow for taking up some of that tension and allow for it to absorb some of the differentiation in vehicle speed and winch speed. And that becomes more dynamic. So those are some of the terms around that. Why don't you talk a little bit, Jim, about working load limit?
Oh, okay. So, it's the one thing that's super important. where you're getting your recovery gear, it should have a few numbers on it. It should be rated. As we say, it should be purpose built for your application. Working load limit, So it's basically the maximum amount of load that a particular piece of equipment has that it can continue to use day in, day out. It doesn't damage it by that amount of working load or stress that's put on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that came from the overhead rigging industry, much of that. So think of it every day in and day out, these shackles are being used to haul loads in a factory or some kind of an industrial setting. So they're designed to work with that load day in and day out. So typically on a metal shackle, a D shackle or a C shackle, screw pin style shackle, we'll see working load limit represented on those components. Oftentimes on pulleys, we'll also see them represented. Now, what we'll also see on consumer recovery gear is minimum braking strength. We may also at times see maximum braking strength too, which I think is something that we want to be careful with, because that's telling us
encourages people to test it.
Yeah, that's right. We want to understand what the minimum braking strength is, which means that there's a degree of repeatability around that certification. And minimum braking strength is very useful for us around vehicle recovery. So you'll typically see minimum braking strength for ropes, and we'll see it for winch line extensions. We'll see that for winch lines, et cetera. We also want to make sure that the components that we're buying have minimum braking strength listed on the item. I don't like it when it just comes in the packaging.
Yeah.
I like it when it actually
has
rated
strength or something.
Yeah,
I think one of the things that you touched on was purpose built stuff. I remember when I was first getting into 4-wheel driving, I'd, go to the farm store and I'd get the same looking shackle that everyone else was getting. But when you really start to kind of drill down into, what separates that from a Van Beest shackle or something, right? I don't know. I think purpose built is a huge thing.
Yeah, totally agree. And working load limit is also not always the same. Most of the inexpensive shackles that we see, they'll be a 4 times rating.
Right.
A Van Beest shackle is a 6 times rating. So it really depends on what you're buying. And that's why it's so important to spend the time to do that research. And for those that are listening and even watching on YouTube, we have an additional member of the cast today, Dak, who is a greyhound, an amazing, awesome greyhound. So make sure you adopt a greyhound if you are interested in.
But he's also licking the table.
He's currently licking, licking the Overland table, the Overland International table.
Exactly.
Minimum braking strength is a really important one. We typically want to have it on the rope or on the shackle or on the pulley block, because it's so easy to get the item separated from its packaging or separated from its tag, for example. If it's integrated in with it, maybe sewn into it, for example, then we have that as a reference when we're going to do a recovery. So it's important to have that. We also want to talk about gross vehicle weight rating. Oftentimes people will say, I'm going to buy the recovery kit for what my curb weight of my vehicle is. That's typically not a good idea because
for multiple reasons. I mean, I've seen a lot of Tacomas with a gross vehicle weight rating of, let's say, 2 pounds and they weigh 8,000. Curb weight is what it actually weighs. Gross vehicle weight rating is what the vehicle is supposed to weigh at its maximum. It is the curb weight of the vehicle. So the dry weight, or however you want to think of it, with its allotted and engineered cargo capacity factored in. Cargo capacity also includes the passengers and all of that thing. It's all cargo. It's all the things that are not bolted in and didn't come from the factory.
Yeah. So we want to make sure that when we purchase recovery equipment, we're buying it for the curb weight or the gross vehicle weight, whichever one is greater, because there are many people out there that own vehicles that are over gross vehicle weight rating. So, but why we want to do that is that a couple things. We can be overloaded for the recovery gear that we have. And then we also need to be mindful of who are we traveling with. If we've got a 70 series Land Cruiser and an Earth Roamer, we have to be thinking about it's not a one size fits all in that situation. So we may need to have different
and you don't
gear.
always want to use, more is not always better, because you have to remember that 1 million pound strap that you need for an Earth Roamer is just going to rip the bumper or the frame off of the Tacoma or
Samurai
or whatever that may be. You also have to factor in rated recovery points. That's not really a huge thing in the United States. That was definitely one of my takeaways when I was working in the magazine world in Australia was that you had rated recovery points as well. And that's something I would love to see happen in the United States, because, you buy an XYZ bumper and it's got a D-ring receptacle welded on the front. Well, what is it welded to? Is it actually engineered? Has there actually been somebody that knows what they're doing, figuring out that calculation?
Well, and
ARB is good on that. ARB does do that.
And they're starting to sell, ARB is starting to sell rated recovery points now.
In the US.
Well, and even just backing up a bit, before you put the expensive bumper on the front, is people confuse recovery points with lashdown points.
Yes.
Which can be very, very different. Some of the older Toyota stuff, it's synonymous. They have very, very high rated factory points. Which is great. But just knowing to recognize that this is for the tow truck to pull this up on or to get strapped down on the car transport versus doing a kinetic recovery where it's going to let go and basically be a missile.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of what looks like a recovery point, like even on a Land Rover, it is just a lashing point.
True.
So it's really important to know what that is. Another reason why we don't want to use straps that are too thick is that if we have a light vehicle, a couple light vehicles, we don't get the rated stretch out of the strap. So you lose a lot of the dynamic effectiveness of a recovery strap or a kinetic energy recovery rope. All right. So the next thing that we want to talk about is the marshal. So when we are doing a recovery, someone's going to be the marshal. It may just be you because you've gotten stuck all by yourself, but you want one person that's responsible, that's in charge. And so they're going to typically be doing a lot of the communication. They're typically going to be doing the spotting and the hand signals. They're also going to be keeping non-essential personnel out of the recovery zone. So there's this triangle that forms within a recovery that is kind of a zone of danger. And we want to keep as many people as possible outside of that. And at certain times, everyone outside of that you can possibly adjust for. So we want to have a marshal in place that's going to be enforcing safety and being good about communicating. They're typically someone with some experience, but we want to be clear about, all right, who's the marshal, who's in charge, and then let everybody else just record it with their cell phone from a distance, right?
Yeah.
So, we want to know who the marshal is. All right. And then now we're going to talk a little bit about the material that some of these ropes and straps are made out of. Some of them will be made out of nylon. Some of them will be made out of polyester, and some of them will be made out of Dyneema. Now, they have very important roles to play. So a nylon strap will have stretch. Now, the amount of stretch depends on how it's woven and how thick it is and other factors. But if you have a nylon strap, it will stretch. So I've actually seen tree straps that were made out of nylon. They got it wrong. The manufacturer got it wrong. And you don't want a tree strap to stretch. We want that to be made out of polyester so that we end up with the effect of null stretch. Now, when we say null, it means limited or the minimum amount possible. Even Dyneema, even that fancy winch line will still stretch a little bit, but we want to achieve null stretch. And then the last thing is Dyneema. Jim, why don't you talk us a little bit about Dyneema?
Well, it come into the off-road world probably 10, 15 years ago. I'll probably get that wrong. Primarily from, like you said earlier, from the lifting industry. But a lot of the other things that we have incorporated into off-roading has come from the sailing industry, which seems odd. But Dyneema was really popular in sailboats. It's light. It's incredibly strong. It actually stretches thickness for thickness less than wire rope. Wire rope tends to unwind and you get stretch in it. So it turned out to be a quite good material for the replacement of winch ropes, for extensions, for those kind of things. There's always the debate: what's better, wire or synthetic?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
They both have their places,
We're getting into it now.
Yeah, it's automatic or manual transmission. I mean, all these. Yeah. So to be fair, I have two vehicles. I have my Land Rover. I have my Jeep. The Jeep has wire rope that it's always had, and it works great. We've used wire rope in this industry and lifting industry for 100 years. It's a very good material for this. Its weaknesses are it does stretch. It has mass. So when something fails, it's a lot more hazardous if you're standing around. Dyneema came into the world. It doesn't stretch as much. So that inherently makes it less dynamic, so less dangerous. It does absolutely have a recoil. The whole thought process that it, you put 10,000 pounds on it, it breaks and it drops to the ground. It does, but it's dropping to the ground while moving across.
Still a lot of energy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing how much we had during one of our winch tests, we had Dyneema fail right at the fair lead. And it took the fancy ARB sail that we had on it, and it took all of the other components, and it went not only back to the tree it was connected to, it went past the tree about 40 yards. So the key to it is that since there's less stretch, it has less energy that's being absorbed in it or retained into it. So that way when it breaks, it doesn't have as much energy to move. However, the key to it is it has less mass. So a cable, the cables that we use for winching, they're also used in the logging industry. People don't know this. They're used in the logging industry to cut logs in half. It actually makes for a really great saw. So the reason why people lose legs and everything else is that it's got mass to it, and it is at high speed. It's a very sharp instrument that can cut through muscle and bone. So if you get hit with Dyneema when it breaks, it doesn't mean you're not going to go to the hospital, but you're probably not going to lose a limb. You're just going to have a really bad welt or maybe a bruise, for example. So it's much safer by reducing the mass and removing the component of it that would be a cutting surface. So that's one of the really big things about Dyneema.
And I think one of the things while we're on this that is worthwhile just bringing up is there are catastrophic effects that can happen from a recovery that goes wrong. So, we talked a little bit about the marshal, the main spotter, but I always like to say, if you don't need to be there, don't be there. You may think that you are helping. You're often just, planting the seeds of confusion. Make sure kids are,
Yep.
You can kind of tell where that's going to, I'm not saying where it's going to break, but you can just remove them from that area. I think that's always something that you can err on the side of caution. I don't know, something that I always just like to throw in. I mean,
yeah, so true.
Yeah.
But
another thing that's nice about Dyneema is it's because it's used in the marine industry is it's UV stable.
Yeah.
So,
a lot of people think that it degrades and stuff.
Yeah, it fades, but it's not really
the
affecting its
dye
strength.
will fade, but
Correct.
the high density polyethylene, that is what Dyneema is. Dyneema is the brand name for HDPE. It's UV inert.
Yeah,
So,
it's very UV stable.
stable. It's not inert. It is stable.
You'll have some reduction in coloring, but it will last a very long time on the front of your vehicle. So those are the terms surrounding it. So let's talk about step one around overlanding and recovery, which is don't get stuck in the first place.
That's the easiest today.
Yeah, just don't get stuck,
Just
guys.
don't do it.
That is it. We're done. Vehicle recovery. Don't get stuck.
So Jim, what are some tips that you would give the listener about what are some things that they can do preemptively to not get stuck in the first place?
Whenever I teach recovery classes, one of the things, and it typically gets a couple of responses. One, if it's a co-ed type class, the female partners typically give a dirty look to the male partners or a knowing look. But what I always say is the automotive industry put a mechanism in cars pretty much since cars have been cars that can get you out of this situation. It's called reverse, which is, again, I'm going to live to fight a different day. I see something and okay, I'm going to get stuck. And sometimes, I'm that guy. Sometimes I'm going to get stuck and that's okay. If you're looking for just a nice day out and you don't want to get muddy or or sweaty or, it's just not the plan today, put it in reverse and try a different way. It's not a failure. It's not a chink in your manhood.
Yeah.
It's just making good decisions.
Separating the ego.
I
think in four-wheel
tough.
driving is so huge.
Yeah.
Most of the catastrophic scenarios I've seen people get into, 100% ego caused.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of times. And if we remember, the goal of overlanding is to travel. So there may be an easier way around. And we're also constantly being mindful of mechanical sympathy. Scenarios that get a vehicle stuck also puts the vehicle under a great deal of stress. So by backing up and taking another route around. Now, if we're just out having fun and we're recreating, then all power to us. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So one of the things that I really want to touch on early in this don't get stuck process is getting not only driver training, but recovery training. Matt and I talk about this frequently in the podcast that the best investment that we can make is in educating ourselves. I look at my travels and I know only 5% of what I aspire to know. And the more training that I can get, the more education that I can get from people like Jim and like 7P or other organizations that are high quality training organizations that have a lot of travel experience, we can gain so much from that. By getting driver training, we can build in a set of skills, toolboxes in our mind and in our muscle memory that allow us to do a better job of driving that reduces the likelihood of us getting stuck. So we want to focus on driver training. More importantly, around all of this, we really want to get training when it comes to vehicle recovery. And that's because it is such a dangerous operation and it can be very complex. Rigging can be very complex depending on the scenario. It's not as simple as unspooling the winch, wrapping the rope around a tree and pushing the button, because that kills the tree, damages the rope, and it has a very high likelihood of a failure point at the hook of the dynema. So all of those things just happened and the uninitiated didn't know that. And that's why training is so critical. So when we think about vehicle recovery, let's make the first priority of looking maybe a local club, maybe go on to one of the forums and find an experienced member that's willing to do maybe some pro bono training, maybe go to an Overland Expo or some kind of another event. But if you really want to get the highest quality training, the most proficiency out of it, you want to look for an organization that has a lot of experience, not only with recovery, but with overland travel as well. You want to be very careful with the trainer that only focuses on recreational four-wheeling, because they will typically focus on the idea of recreational four-wheeling, which is maximizing the vehicle in technical terrain, as opposed to maybe being as conservative as you need to be as a traveler. So find trainers that are also have a couple of passports.
Yeah. I mean, and, you know, I know you work for 7P, but I think that's one of the cool things with 7P is like all of the guys I know, they're incredibly well traveled. You know, I mean, you are an international organization too. Earlier, you're talking about your, you know, guys in Scotland and guys in Wales and, you know, kind of all over the place. You know, there is, you know, I4WDTA. This is not to say anything negative on them. I4WDTA is certification body. But within that, you're going to find, you know, a plethora of different personalities and types. You know, just to kind of reiterate what Scott said, make sure you find somebody that is not trying to teach you how to drive an Ultra 4 course. Somebody that's teaching you like, okay, you're traveling around the world. You're not, maybe that they understand actually what you're doing.
Well, and being a traveler is key because it gives them the insights of regulations in other countries. It helps them understand the things that you encounter as a traveler, the things you encounter when you come through a port or through a border crossing, or the other kinds of vehicles that you will interact with, and maybe the other cultures that you'll interact with, and that helps you be more successful. Overland Experts is another good organization that we like to recommend for training as well. Yeah,
it's one of the things. If somebody's new into this world, they've bought a vehicle or they haven't even bought a vehicle, but they're wanting to. A lot of people have, if you say off-roading specifically, you know, they think of Baja 1000. Back to the trainer, you know, if your trainer shows up with the rock buggy on the trailer and you want an overlanding aspect, you might have picked the wrong person. Yeah. And conversely, if you want to go fast and they show up in my Land Rover or a Sprinter van, it's like, probably the wrong person. So
your Land Rover can do anything it wants.
Right till it doesn't.
Until it doesn't.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's a very broad recreation.
It is.
Overlanding, like you say, Scott, it's more about, and it doesn't have to be world travel. I mean, that's what the three of us absolutely aspire to, but it can be as simple as just, you know, okay, I'm going to go out for a week and just go from point to point. But it is about vehicle sympathy. It's not about, you don't have a pit crew. So when you roll into camp, there's not going to be a whole bunch of people putting your car back together because you've abused it all day. So it is vehicle sympathy.
And it really is a mindset that comes with that. And that's why you want to have that good fit between the trainer and the traveler. And that's just what we're recommending, is make sure that the trainer is also a traveler themselves, because it will help not only them be more relatable, but have some more insights that will help you in your travels wherever you're going. So training is really important. And another thing that helps us with not getting stuck is using the right vehicle for the conditions. I think about if I was to drive my 110 in Antarctica, I don't think I would make it off the runway.
You would freeze.
To death.
I would freeze to death. Yeah, exactly. Probably wouldn't start.
Wouldn't be able to see it on the windscreen in about 2 seconds.
Yeah, it'd be all fogged up. So use the right vehicle for the conditions. So if you're going to be crossing large swaths of sand dunes, you want a certain kind of vehicle. That's going to help you get stuck a little less. Pair your vehicle well to the terrain. think about the terrain that you're going to be crossing. By having the right vehicle, there's
and while we're talking about it, pair the vehicle to the modifications you're going to make too. I mean, absolutely. Again, I always I use the example of the ubiquitous Tacoma that weighs, what a Super Duty should, but a Tacoma with 3,000 pounds of stuff on it is going to get stuck really easy. Yeah. That vehicle, that amount of tire, there's a lot of things that go into the amount of gearing the vehicle has. Make sure that, if you're going to put a 4-wheel camper or some kind of expedition conversion or something, make sure the vehicle is actually designed to carry that kind of weight, because that greatly affects your off-road capability.
Yeah, well, no question. And understanding that so you buy, we'll pick on Tacoma, even though it's a magnificent vehicle.
Yeah. I mean, we're picking on it because it's amazing. Because they're great.
Yeah, it never breaks down. Yeah, unlike. Anyway, so you buy this car, and I get this all the time, and people are like, okay, I want to lift it. I want to put bigger tires. I want to put the rear rack, the rooftop tent. And I always try, anything you do, anything has a plus and a minus.
Yeah.
So yes, I go drive it. I need a little bit more ground clearance. So I'm going to lift it up a little bit. Cool. You've changed the center of gravity. You've done this. It's better here, but it's less capable here. So just going into it with the mindset that everything I do is going to have a plus and a minus.
Yeah.
So as long as you understand that, then you're a lot more eyes open when you make your purchases.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's so true. And then talking about purchases, making sure that the tires are appropriate to the conditions. I mean, it's amazing how many people buy mud tires and they live in the desert. It's not the best tire for the desert. So making sure that you have the right tire, which will really help around getting stuck, especially when you're talking about mud. But you're more likely to get stuck in the sand with a low horsepower vehicle with a mud tire than you would be with an all-terrain. And that's simply because of the flotation effect and the way that the sand keys with the lugs. Now, the more that those lugs dig, the more that they become a paddle with low horsepower, the more likely you're going to go down instead of forward. So you want to pair the right tire for that as well. And then you also want to start by airing down. It's so fun.
Yeah. Can we just end this now? Like, how to not get stuck. Air down your tires. Well, see you later, guys.
I'm always amazed. So we'll get out, and sand is probably the biggest place where you see somebody stuck and not horrible stuck, but just kind of stuck. And you go out, and the first question I ask, have you aired down your tires? And they look at you like,
what magic do you?
Why would I want flat tires? And quite literally, taking 20 pounds out of the tires, and they drive right out. It's like, you're not stuck anymore. Yeah. It's not magic.
The best way that I can articulate this to someone is take like a grapefruit or a balloon or something soft and squishy and just put it down on the ground. And what you'll notice is the more pressure you put on it, the more, the wider that footprint gets. Specifically for a vehicle, your surface area grows in length, which is what I call the tank track effect, or however you want to do it. Yeah. Tim Huber, who's another 7P guy. I remember a while ago, I want to say it was for an Overland Expo training course, actually like jacked his vehicle up.
The road shack stuff.
Yeah. Painted a tire or something, put it down. Okay. Here's what 60 PSI looks like, which is, for people watching on YouTube, which is about that big. And then here's
very
what
small contact patch
8 PSI looks like, and it's about that big. I mean, it's the biggest thing. Also ride quality, all of it, tire durability.
Again, and again, one of my mantras, there's a downside.
Yeah.
Which is, well, first of all, if you air down, you better have a way to air back up.
Yes.
Or you're just being silly. But as you air down, you're exposing the sidewall to more damage potentially, especially in rocks and such like that. You're reducing your overall ground clearance, because if you take a big sidewall and you air it down, you might lose. I mean, on mine going from 35 to 15, I lose about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of ground clearance.
Which is significant.
It can be. So
in the sand dunes, it's not, but in the rocks, it certainly is. Yeah.
I mean, think about how much money people spend on larger tires and suspension and whatever to gain that amount of ground clearance. And they don't realize that if you're doing it right, you're just losing it right back again.
Yep. Starting right back to zero. So again, everything has a plus and a minus. As long as your eyes open with it, it's okay.
Yeah, it really does. And tire pressures are key. For those that are listening, since this is a principles series for us, a good rule of thumb, if you're in soft conditions, is to start by matching the tire pressure to the wheel diameter. If you have a 17-inch wheel, go down to 17 PSI. If you have a 20-inch wheel, go down to 20 PSI. Use that as a starting point in soft conditions. You may find that you need to go lower than that. If you're in a lot of sharp rocks, you want to be a little higher than that. But that is a general rule of thumb, is that if we have a 17-inch wheel, we want to start by going down to about 17 PSI. Now, a lot of that is it's variable, right? This is a general rule of thumb that someone can remember as a starting point. You have a very heavy vehicle.
Yeah, if you're in a four-wheel camper, Super Duty Ram 3500 thing, don't go to 17 pounds of pressure.
Well, and you may need to in the sand dunes. And there's ways to do that by, for example, using a chalk line test, or for painting the carcass of the tire and then putting it down onto an imprint test, so that you can see how much of an increase in surface area you get. But there's things that you can monitor, like if you have bead locks, you can go lower. But we're really looking at what are the temperatures of the tire. So going out and doing some testing, bring out a temperature gauge. In the days of COVID, I think a lot more people have.
They're like $3 now.
Yeah, you can point the little temperature laser at the carcass of the sidewall, and you can determine what the temperature of the tire is. But that's a good starting point, is around the diameter of the wheel, start around that point, and then adjust from there. That helps us with a starting point. But we definitely want to be looking at airing down as a solution to help us keep from getting stuck as well. So now, because we want to talk about counterpoints, so the whole goal around this is falsifiability of this idea of don't get stuck. The alternate to that idea is do get stuck.
Get stuck a lot.
Go out and get stuck a lot.
Yeah.
Go out with your friends.
Be 16-year-old me.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
For some reason, there's this stigma about getting stuck. It's okay to get stuck. It's fun to get stuck. We learn and we grow, and we can try out all this cool new gear that we bought, and we can work with our friends to come up with solutions, and we can become more proficient at getting unstuck, which means when we are on the skeleton coast and the tide is coming in and we're about to lose our vehicle, we have that muscle memory, that effectiveness, those tools of the trade, and those skills in our mind that allow us to get unstuck very efficiently.
Yeah, the better you get at it. I mean, it's absolutely that. The more you do it, the better you become. And to get stuck in a controlled environment is a lot better to build those skills. Recoveries, I think for people who've never done them, they're amazed at the length of time it takes to do it right. So you can rush into, especially with winch recovery, you can rush in there and get it wrong and have to reset and do it again. And inevitably, to take a moment and to think through the process and get it right the first time, do it safely, do it efficiently, it still takes a fair chunk of time. And so people really underestimate that. The more you do it, the more you build that muscle memory, like you're saying, the more efficient you are, the faster it is. But it's never fast, really isn't. So
I've got a fun question for you, Jim. What is your best stuck story? I mean, when a Camel Trophy guy gets like insanely stuck, like what was
Have
the
you
one
ever had to swim out of a car?
yeah. Like everybody hasn't?
I was just messing with you. Hey, go ahead and be Jim West.
So I guess, well, what I will say is it wasn't a stuck, but it was an oops. And so I think we were one of the first teams to ever roll over a camel car during training at Eastner Castle. And our instructor saw it coming a mile away. It was in this winch 4, was I think what it's called. So this is mud bog. And he said, right, you're going to go in, you're going to get stuck here, Jim, because Dan was driving. Jim, you'll jump out and you can pick a winch, basically set up a winch. It's like, okay, cool. Well, us being arrogant Americans, as we are.
We're the best.
Exactly. Yeah, just ask us. And we kind of looked at it and it's like, I think I asked, I said, so Colin, how about we just drive through it and not get stuck? Do we have to get stuck? And he's like, no, what are you thinking? It's like, well, if we go down this right side, keep a little bit of side tread on that mud wall, very vertical mud wall, that becomes important in a moment. I think, and Dan goes, yeah, I think I go in here in second gear, I bang third gear, get it on the turbo. I say, we go right across this bog and we don't get muddy. We don't get our wellies muddy. And Colin said, I think that's an interesting plan, boys. And he did something he hadn't done all day. He said to one of our journalists, Peter McGillivray, who I think still runs SEMA now. Cool. He was a photographer for four-wheelers way back then. He said, Pete, how about you and I get out of the car and we'll go stand over there, which should have been our first clue that something was probably going to go amiss. Anyway, to try to keep the story short, we bailed in. Dan banged third gear beautifully. Came on the turbo. I'm hanging out. I keep saying a little bit right. And he was just enough right that when it grabbed traction, it flipped the car right onto its side. And so not stuck, but definitely forward progress paired. So we got out. He says, okay, boys, I'll get on the radio. And actually, we're laying in our belts and thinking, well, that's it. We're not going to Camel Trophy because we just laid a car on its side. So he looked down through my window and said, hey, boys, are you okay in there? And yeah, he goes, okay, I'll get on the radio and have somebody come recover you. At which point we said, can we just do it ourselves? He said, what's your plan? And so basically we did kind of a version of a pendulum winch where we came off to a tree, back to a tree, and back to the car, winched the car back on its wheels, moved it forward, and we managed to get it out. So that was, he let us do it. Do the fail so we could have the victory. And he saw our plan. So not my best stuck, but definitely one where learned the most lesson of especially what a winch can do if you have some imagination.
Sure. What's yours?
Yeah.
Well, I think
in Zanzibar.
I think my funniest one was it was my first off-road vehicle, which was a two-wheel drive Isuzu Amigo.
Oh, perfect.
And I was growing up in Southern California, and I decided I was going to go out wheeling after work, and which means I had nothing in the vehicle. I had no idea how to operate it. I had no idea what airing down meant. I had no idea. I just thought everything was solved with as much speed as possible. So I was going back and forth through this.
Wait, it isn't?
Solid plan.
So I was going back and forth through this mud hole. Again, two-wheel drive. And of course, it's always the last. I'm like, I'm going to do it one more time. And so now I'm stuck. I can actually hear Highway 101 in the distance. So I'm probably someplace I shouldn't have been. So then the only thing I had in the vehicle was the drapes from the business that I was working for.
Oh man!
So my boss asked me to go get the drapes laundered. So that's all I had. So I shoved the drapes underneath the wheels.
You really needed it then.
Yeah. And that did, of course, nothing to get me out. So
it's the most Southern California thing I've ever heard. Make sure that you go launder the drapes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to use them as max tracks.
Yeah. So I was thoroughly sucked. So I had to walk up to the freeway, find the emergency call box, eat crow. So that was probably my most hilarious stuck. But canning stock route in the wet was the most difficult. We had, at one count, 12 max tracks. We were building a road. It took us 14 hours to get out.
Yeah.
And it was probably my most enjoyable travel experience I've ever had. It was probably that experience that reminded me how much enjoyment comes out of getting stuck, how much fun it is to make fun of ourselves, how much it is important to learn the hard way and to get stuck and to stay proficient at it. So
it's a process.
So Matt, you got to tell us your favorite stuck story.
Who?
And were you wearing flip-flops?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I was wearing Queensland boots and board shorts. I guess mine, I had just left my job as editor of Unsealed. We were living in Sydney. We spent a few days in Brisbane hanging out with some friends and then set out on this, I think it was just under 6-month trip all around Australia off-road in our Land Cruiser. And first day, we're outside of this town called 1770, north of Bundaberg. And beach we wanted to go to, tide was too high, couldn't get through to the camping spot we wanted. So we were driving up this kind of access track. And there's all these, places, water crossings, right? And I'm walking all of them. Laura was walking most of them. I was not the one walking them. I was driving. It was, the cowboy thing. The
Important fact.
The gate. Well, I decided, we don't need to do that. I'm just going to drive through the grass on this one. And, of course, Laura, who I have learned is generally right.
Wise man.
Why are you doing this? Don't do this. It'll be fine. So our Land Cruiser probably weighed 8 squillion pounds. And I remember that it had 68 kilowatts at the rear wheels, which is not many horsepowers. It was slow. It was heavy. And it was sunk to the frame and then some. And I had like one small bush to winch from. And I had, luckily, I had 8 max tracks with me, 4 on the roof, 4 on the back. This is before I worked with max tracks. And I ended up having to basically use the winch to position myself forward. There was nothing that I could attach to go backwards. So I had to winch straight forward. And then I had to go onto the max tracks. And then I had to put max tracks behind it so I could kind of leapfrog myself backwards. Because going forward was just it wasn't an option because I knew that I had a viable path had I just listened to Laura. So there you go. Step 1, don't get stuck. Listen to other people. Listen to your significant other.
Always.
But it took us hours. And this was the first day of our trip. We have these, I think traveling becomes a bit romantic. And, we thought, okay, our first big day out, we're going to be gone for a while. We're going to spend it on this beach by 1770. It's going to be really cool. We'll hang out there. I ended up scarfing down McDonald's and staying in a hotel. We didn't talk for about 2 hours because I knew. I knew.
Yeah.
I new. Yeah, that's me.
That's a great story. It's good to learn that one young.
I had the bug bites on my legs for some time.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the stuck stories. They're really fun. So
Everybody.
Now, Jim, you said you had one that was even better.
Well,
it involved you stealing a bike.
Yeah, I hate one-upping, but your story just reminded me of, and again, it's the ones that you learn early. So it's a 16-year-old version of me, so terrifying. And a girl, not even a girlfriend, but she had I want to say it was like a 75 Ford short bed, four-wheel drive. Back in those days, I didn't have anything four-wheel drive, kind of like your Isuzu.
They used to be really expensive.
I know, yes, and
uncommon,
yeah. And as I was raised, my dad said four-wheel drive means four-wheel stuck. He knew me well before he knew me. So we're out and quite literally in downtown Phoenix at Shaw Butte, which is now all houses. I love driving by there still. We're out four-wheeling between the mountains and we go down through this. It had rained, so we're out splashing through washes and stuff. The one rare time that there's actually water in Phoenix. And we go through this wash and I get stuck. And because she always loved four-wheeling, but she never liked to drive. It was her truck. So I, of course, perfect time to put it in four-wheel drive. Again, you learn these lessons now. Which the back was already buried. So the four-wheel drive managed to accomplish the front going down is equally far as the back now. So we're on the frame rails are lower.
Yeah.
We dig a bit because all I have is a shovel, no winch, no nothing.
At least you had a shovel.
Had a shovel.
Back then, even thinking.
No, it was hers. Yeah, it was hers. So I dig and realize fairly quickly that this is basically, we're going to have to wait a couple months for this to dry out and then drive out. Or call my dad, which was
Phoenix, couple of hours.
A bad idea. I said, listen, I'm going to go call a buddy of mine, Kenny, who's we are like-minded and the world survived, two of us. So he's getting off work. I'm going to call him. So cell phones obviously didn't exist in 1976. I hike for about 2 miles, get into a housing community, and there's a bike laying there in the front yard. And I thought, okay, cool. But no lights on anywhere. And so I steal the bike. I temporarily appropriate the bike. I ride to the first house that has lights on, which is about a mile away. Again, this stuff would never happen in these days. Thank God. The gal answers the door. She's babysitting. She's probably 16. And she lets me in. I use the phone. I call Kenny. He says he'll be off in an hour. Cool. I ride back. My biggest fear of this whole evening was getting caught putting the bike back.
Yeah, sure.
Because nobody's going to believe, no, I'm putting it back. Yeah, not a chance. Do that, hike back. He shows up an hour later with his two-wheel drive truck, promptly gets it stuck. He has a strap, which didn't help. And so we start digging. Again, one of just the silly things that you remember, there were a lot of frogs out and the frogs were making a lot of noise. And apparently for some reason, they were annoying Kenny. I'm under the truck digging and he says, okay, I've had about enough of these frogs. And I was like, well, yeah, what are you going to do? Kill them all? Pulls out his .22 rifle from the back seat of the truck and proceeds to go through, I don't know how many rounds, but in fact does kill I don't know if he killed every frog, but he absolutely silenced them all. And then came back and again, looks crossed paths with each other. We dug for about another 4 hours, then we had the trucks out. So.
Amazing.
And let's learn from Kenny and not kill frogs.
Yes. Yeah. It's definitely not ecologically sound. It's a bad practice. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I love this story.
I like stealing the bicycle.
Yeah. It just seemed like the thing to do at the moment, but I really was terrified of getting caught putting it back.
But that's so good though, that like you were trying to do the right thing. And I think they would have understood.
Borrowing. Well, you'd like to think, but...
So this concludes part 1 of our Principles of Overlanding on Recovery. You can find part 2 within the next few weeks. So by the middle of January of 2021, you'll find the next episode posted for part 2. If you'd like to find out more information on Jim West, you can follow him on Instagram at myquest38. And you can also find out more information about his four-wheel drive training and his team with 7P International. And if you'd like to follow Matt, you can follow him at Matt Explore on Instagram. And if you would like to contact me about any feedback or questions on the show, you can reach me at scott.a.brady on Instagram as well. Thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you next time.